Today I'm going to be presenting some of the research in my job market paper. And I've really only presented this before to economists. But because I'm working at the intersection of economics, soil science, and agronomy, I really welcome additional perspectives. That's one of the reasons why I want to present to you today. So if you have any questions or feedback, especially in relation to those fields, I really appreciate it. OK, I can use this. OK, so the first thing that I want to show is this headline from a New York Times article that was published last July. In it, it calls the loss of fertile land in Sub-Saharan Africa a looming crisis that has the potential to move vast new numbers of people into food insecurity in that region. And the causes of this are many and they're complex, but they include the increasing intensification of agricultural practices and a corresponding lack of inputs used in the soils to replenish the nutrients lost through crop production. And with increasing population pressures and climate change, this situation is probably going to get worse over the coming years. And the result, if nothing changes, is environmental degradation, food insecurity, and rural poverty. And a major obstacle to reversing this trend is that farmers often don't have sufficient information about their soils to make profit-maximizing, soil fertility-enhancing choices about agricultural input usage. And in Kenya, it's different than some of the other countries in Sub-Saharan Africa because it's not that they're not using necessarily enough fertilizer or inputs. Often they're using a lot of inorganic fertilizer. But the problem is this is often the wrong inputs to use for their soils, especially if they have common problems in their soils, such as low organic matter or high acidity. Their soils may not be responsive to this type of inorganic fertilizer. Also, farmers usually only have information about their soil quality through past crop yields. But if they have a poor harvest, this doesn't necessarily tell them whether it's because of low organic matter, low nitrogen levels, or some other factor. And the optimal input strategy to improve that soil will depend greatly on which of these situations is present. Complicating things, there's a high degree of spatial heterogeneity or spatial variation in soil nutrient levels within small areas of Sub-Saharan Africa, even at the village and the farm scale. And this makes general fertilizer recommendations ineffective. And so what this means is there's a high degree of uncertainty in effective matches between the input use, a farmer's input use, and soil type and quality. So a major research question that I had is whether providing farmers with the results of individualized soil tests and input recommendations can enable them to better optimize their input usage, and whether this would be a cost-effective way to do it. So to measure this, I use an experimental auction design that's after Becker de Groot Marshak. And essentially, this is a lab-in-the-field experiment using a random price auction to measure farmers' willingness to pay for various fertilizers and inputs. And I'll talk a lot more about this later. But we use this in 2 rounds, both before and after the farmers receive the results of soil information tests to measure the effect of this information on their behavior. And just to preview our results, we find that the soil information test had a significant effect on farmer behavior, but this varied greatly depending on the type of inputs and the gender of the participant from the auctions. So just an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. So first I'll talk about some related literature to our study. Then I'll move and talk about the research background, especially about soils in Western Kenya. Then I'll describe how I collected the data and the experimental auction and the design of the experimental auction. What is an experimental auction? Then I'll describe the empirical methods that I used to estimate these data and the results. And I'll talk about this estimation technique I use called the triple difference estimation. And then I'll talk about the cost-benefit analysis we ran with these results that show the net benefits from these soil tests. And then I'll close with a discussion of the results and some policy implications. So as I mentioned before, there's a high degree of heterogeneity or variation in soil nutrient levels within small areas. And so what this means is if there's 2 farmers who are neighbors in a village, say Farmer I and Farmer J. And Farmer J has a lot of success using a type of fertilizer or an input. This doesn't necessarily mean that Farmer I would have the same success, just because their soils might be very different from one another, even though they're neighbors in this village. And so what this means is information diffusion about inputs and fertilizers through a village may be hindered. Maybe there may not be very much diffusion because of this heterogeneity. We also see in the literature that information transfers can greatly improve on optimal matches between products and preferences. This is especially shown in the marketing literature, actually, with advertising and consumer choice, but we apply this literature to our context here. There's also other ongoing studies that analyze the effect of soil information transfers on farmer behavior. For example, the Fishman et al. Paper looks at this in the Indian context, where the Indian government has actually begun to give farmers information about their soils and fertilizer recommendations. But Fishman et al. Find that these transfers have had no effect on farmer behavior. And they believe that this is because the farmers don't trust this information that's coming from the government, so they don't change any of their practices. The Mickelson et al. Paper looks at this in Tanzania. And they couple these soil information transfers with fertilizer vouchers and find that by combining these two things together, farmers greatly increase their spending, their choice to use inorganic fertilizers. But actually, the Tanzanian context is really different from the Kenyan context, even though they're neighboring countries, because in Tanzania, very few farmers are using any sort of fertilizer. But in Kenya, actually, there's a lot of fertilizer being used. It's just maybe not the best fertilizer. It's not the most effective strategies that they're using for their soils. And the Corral et al. Paper is a very preliminary paper that's looking at this in Mexico. So as I mentioned before, in Western Kenya, soils are highly degraded. There's a lot of soil nutrient depletion, acidification, erosion that's causing these soils to be in a very degraded state. But it's not uncommon in these areas for farmers to use inorganic fertilizers in excess of profit maximizing levels. In many cases, they're using a lot of inorganic fertilizers, such as DAP, or diammonium phosphate. But, and this is actually shown in this paper, the Sheehan et al. Paper, which are actually from some Cornell graduates. And they show that in many cases, these fertilizers are being used too much. But that's a paradox then. Why are our soils so degraded if they're using so much fertilizer? And it's because these soils are often not responsive to inorganic fertilizers. So actually, this Rubric et al. Paper is looking at this in Kenya. And in their study, they find that inorganic fertilizer application in line with government recommendations does not increase crop yields in up to 30% of household farms. So that's a really large loss in investments and an ineffective use of fertilizers. And these are often very credit-constrained farmers. So this is a significant effect on them. So what we did is we sampled about 550, 560 soils from Western Kenya, analyzed these. I analyzed them with the help of the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture. And here, I'm just showing the results of these soil tests compared to critical threshold levels for these various nutrients. These are critical threshold values for effective maize production. And you can see that in the majority of these soil samples, that they have insufficient nutrient levels to really effectively produce any meaningful crop yields. You can see this especially for nitrate and phosphorus, where about 96% of the samples are below critical thresholds. So we collected these soil samples from randomly selected households in Western Kenya, and we conducted household surveys and experimental auctions with the participants from July through November of last year. And as I mentioned, we analyzed these soils with the help of International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, The soils were analyzed in Maseno, Kenya, which is in western Kenya, using a soil dock wet chemistry kit. And this is an interesting new product that's been developed by the Earth Institute at Columbia University. And what it does is it's a way to analyze soils in remote locations using battery-powered devices that give very accurate results relatively inexpensively. And so because they can explain it, the people who developed it can explain it better than I can, I have a very short 2-minute video on this soil dock kit that I wanted to show you.
In Sub-Saharan Africa, many soils are depleted of the basic nutrients needed to grow food, and rebuilding these soils back to health is critical. What's more, soil sampling, testing, and analysis has been an inefficient process plagued with errors and delays.
A large problem in Africa is the lack of on-site soil information to be able to prescribe the proper fertilizer and organic matter recommendations. So a colleague of ours, Professor Ray Weil, from the University of Maryland, decided to bring the lab into the field.
The soil dock uses state-of-the-art battery-powered instruments to measure soil health and make real-time crop nutrient recommendations.
So the lab in the box has little miniaturized sensors that are battery operated, so you don't need electricity. You can analyze phosphorus levels in the soil to see if there's enough, and if there's insufficient, you'd recommend phosphorus fertilizer.
Field tests are run for pH, phosphorus, potassium, nitrate, sulfur, EC, and active carbon. Readings are sent by SMS text to a virtual lab that responds with specific soil nutrient recommendations in real time.
The idea then is that all this data that we get gets accumulated in the cloud with crowdsourcing, and it helps build up a huge database of soil data for Africa.
With SoilDoc and trained extension agents, it's possible for African farmers to get the crop nutrient recommendations they need and to significantly increase their crop yields.
Okay, yeah, so we used that SoilDoc kit. We used it a little bit differently though, because we were analyzing so many soils in such a short amount of time. We actually kept the kit in one location and brought the soils to the kit. And then also because of that, we didn't have to use the SMS capability of the SoilDoc kit. But essentially, we used that kit to analyze these soils, and it was really accurate and really effective way to do it. So we sampled soils from 18 villages in western Kenya, through 3 counties of western Kenya, Bungoma, Busia, and Kakamega, for people who know the geography of that area. And show a map here. Oh. Sorry, I double-clicked. There. There. So you can see Uganda's over here, Lake Victoria's down here, Kisumu's down here, that's the largest city in western Kenya. And the samples of the soils that we sampled are from the villages with the red dots. So you can see Kakamega County, Bungoma County up here, and then northern Busia County. So we captured soils from a wide area of western Kenya. And so in total, we sampled about 884 individuals in 548 households. And the reason there's more individuals than households is because we wanted to survey both the household head and the spouse in a household. But in many cases, the spouse was not present, so we could only survey one individual from some of the households. Generally, because of the high population density in this area, farms are very small. So in our sample, the average farm area, excluding the homestead area, was just over 1 acre. So these are very small farms. And we specifically excluded large commercial farms from our analysis. So we were focusing on small-scale farmers, which are the majority of the population in this area. In the past year, 88% of the households from our sample had used an inorganic fertilizer, and 45% had used an organic input. And this is over 2 cropping seasons. And the mean household spending per week on food for these households was about 1,200 Kenyan shillings, or $12. The median, though, was less than this at 800 Kenyan shillings. And here are a few more summary statistics of our data. So you can see, since we were sampling household heads, the average age was about 48 years old. But this had a huge range, from 19 years old to a woman who said she was 109 years old. So I don't know if she was actually 109, but she was really old. Years of education on average was about 8. This ranged from 0, which was the mode of the sample, to 26. And that's because there was a couple PhDs actually that we captured in our sample. Said they had 26 years of education. But because years of education doesn't necessarily mean quality of education, we also asked the farmers if they could solve a simple math problem. So we asked them a simple, very simple multiplication problem. Just over half the farmers were able to answer that correctly. The majority of the sample was female. That's partly because of the high number of widows in the sample, but also because many of the men in this area had migrated to larger cities for work, leaving women in the area often as the de facto household heads. You can see also that about 13% of the sample had had contact with an NGO in the past 5 years. And these other variables down here just indicate some of the development levels of the households in our sample. So you can see that almost half the sample relied on rivers as their water source. A few households, 13%, had connection to an electricity grid. A bit more than that had solar panels, but those two are not mutually exclusive. Many people who were on the grid also had solar panels because electricity is not very reliable in this area. Also, most of the households had metal roofs, and most also had mud walls. So the typical house in our sample had a metal roof and mud walls. So I want to move on to start talking about my experimental auction design. But first I want to talk about the things that we were auctioning, the different inputs. So we auctioned first DAP fertilizer, diammonium phosphate, which is the most common inorganic fertilizer in that area. And it's an inorganic source of nitrogen and phosphorus. We auctioned farmyard manure. We also auctioned vermicompost. So some of you may know what vermicompost is, but many of you probably don't. It's actually compost that's been digested through earthworms. So it's a very rich, very strong organic amendment, organic compost. This is a picture of it. So you can see it's very dark, and you can see it's a very kind of healthy source of organic matter. And of course, Janice could tell everything you'd want to know about vermicompost. And we got this vermicompost from a company called Dudutech in Kenya that's actually producing vermicompost for sale. And of course, vermicompost, some of the things it can do. This is not a total list, but it can lower rate of nitrogen release, lower salinity stress, pathogen suppression, among other benefits. We also auctioned biochar, which is sort of charcoal that's produced through a pyrolysis process. And so that's made in a kiln that's deprived of oxygen. And it gives this really rich kind of charcoal type substance. This is an image of it here. And it has a lot of agricultural benefits. And actually, we're still finding out many of the benefits that biochar has. But it can decrease soil acidity, increase retention of soil nutrients and moisture, decrease prevalence of pathogens, and other benefits. So vermicompost and biochar, they're less well known, but they have a lot of agricultural benefits. And of course, many of the farmers in this area wouldn't know what vermicompost or biochar are. So before the auction took place, the enumerators gave a description of these different inputs and the benefits that they had to the farmers. So moving on to the experimental auction. So the objective of the experimental auction is to measure the willingness to pay, WTP, willingness to pay for inputs, both before and after they receive the soil information. And this was done in after Becker-de-Groot-Marchak, which is a random price auction methodology. And what that means is, so in a typical auction, you'd have a group of people who are bidding on different products, different things. But what a random price auction does is there's an individual who's making a bid for a product, but they don't know what the price will be of the product. So they'll only successfully get the product if they bid higher than the random price, which is revealed at the end. So the benefit of a random price auction is you can auction things to individuals without having a large group of people present. So you can do that one-on-one with an individual. And so that's what we did in our experimental auction. And we gave participants a cash endowment of about 840 Kenyan shillings, or $8. And the enumerators made it clear to the participants that this was their money. They didn't actually have to use it in the experimental auction itself. So they could use it however they wanted: school fees, food, anything. And we included these practice auctions to enable the participants to understand how the auction methodology worked. So included in that cash endowment was 70 Kenyan shillings per practice auction round. And they'd bid for things like cookies and biscuits just to familiarize themselves with this experimental auction. So we did that twice with each participant before the primary auction took place. And then after the practice auctions, we had full auctions for different fertilizers and inputs, as I mentioned before: the DAP, farmyard manure, biochar, vermicompost, and then mixtures of these different inputs. And this is a graphic to better illustrate how the auction worked. So first, there were the practice auctions, where the participants learned the auction methodology. Then after that, they received the rest of the cash endowment, an additional 700 Kenyan shillings, about $7. And the enumerators made it clear to the participants this was their money. They didn't have to use it in the auction. Then the enumerators conducted a baseline auction with the participants for these different fertilizers and inputs. So the participants bid on each one of these inputs. Then they were randomly divided into a different treatment or a control group based on the enumerator's tablet computer. It just randomly assigned them to different groups. And I'll talk more about these treatment groups in a couple minutes. Then after they received an information transfer, depending on their treatment group, a second experimental auction took place. And this second auction was exactly the same as the first auction. The only difference was that there was that information transfer in between. And so they happened within 15 minutes of one another, 15 or 20 minutes. After this second auction round, the enumerator's tablet computer randomly selected one auction round to be binding, randomly selected a product, and a random price. And if that individual had bid at least that random price or higher for that random product in that auction round, they paid the random price and received the input. Otherwise, they kept the full cash endowment. So I know it's a little complicated, so I just want to stop and see if there's any questions on this. Okay. This is a picture of the auction. So you can see down here, these are the different inputs that are bagged. And we did it in these clear plastic bags so that there wouldn't be any packaging to influence people's bids. Yeah?
So, sorry, who typically buys the fertilizer for the household? Is it the women who become the stand-in household, heads of households, or is it the men, so they would buy it before and then they would go to work wherever?
I'd say it really depended on the particular household situation. Obviously, and I'll actually talk about in a few slides, men use a lot more fertilizer and inputs than women do. So if it's a household where it's a woman as the household head, usually they're consuming less fertilizer. They're using less fertilizer and less inputs than male-headed households. So I'd say it just really depends. I'd say overall it's usually the men who are doing that purchasing, but there's a lot of exceptions to that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we did the auctions with each individual, and we made sure that the other person was not in the same area. So they weren't influenced by each other at all. Yeah. Thanks.
When you solve the things, when people are aware that, the reaction to the biochar might be 10 or 20 tons per hectare, well, the inorganic.
Yeah. Yeah, they did. So when they were giving the explanations, they told them, what optimal rates were for these things. And of course, the maximum that we were giving was 5 kilos, which is not very much, especially for biochar or farmyard manure. So these would be for like very small, garden plots, basically. Small demos, yeah. Yeah, but yeah, they had the understanding. So the bids were appropriately different. The average bid for biochar, I think the average bid per kilo for biochar was like 20 cents or like 20 Kenyan shillings, where for DAP, it was like 100 shillings, like $1, So there's a corresponding difference in how much they'd be bidding for these different products.
And I understood, though, that they did in huge amounts.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so yeah, that.
When you said women don't buy most of these products as much as men, I was wondering, did your research also try to find out what they were using instead? Because I know that for 2 of the products you mentioned, the vermicompost, most of these women, the rural women, they have their sources. Because if you go to very dense areas, you have where earthworms make like a little hill. I know traditionally they pick that up and use it as manure. Then in place of biochar, I've known that, I've seen it done, mostly women, because men are usually in a hurry to do things. So mostly the women, they pick from their wood, the ash from their wood, and I've seen them spread it under corn plants when they see that they are turning yellow instead of green. So women have been good at doing that. So I'm guessing that maybe not buying so much may mean that maybe they have options.
No, definitely. And I should have mentioned, yeah, usually they're only buying inorganic fertilizer, like DAP. For organic inputs, that's something that's usually produced on their own farm. Maybe it's traded with neighbors, but not that much. So the primary means of obtaining these organic inputs is definitely from their own farm. And so in our surveys, we actually ask that. Have you used farmyard manure? Have you used compost? Have you heard of vermicompost before? Have you used vermicompost? Same thing with biochar. So yeah, we also tried to get with that in our survey.
All right. Mine is a question surrounding the blanket application of fertilizers. Is it government recommended top dressing, meso dressing, or it's regionally dependent, or it's regions recommending? What was your finding based on?
Yeah, my understanding is, and I'm not an expert on the government fertilizer policies, but the government advocated fertilizer applications are very high and with inorganic fertilizer. So it's like DAP, NPK, things like that. And as I mentioned, that one paper, the Rubric et al. Paper, is showing that when they're applying that much inorganic fertilizer, in many cases, it's not having an effect. So yeah, so my understanding is they're national recommendations, but there may be sub-national recommendations also. But that's something that I'm not really clear on, is these different levels of recommendations by the government.
Yeah. My question is on the national recommendation of fertilizer. If you look at the smallholder farmers in various developing countries, so the major issue is the soil information with regards to, they have taken into consideration the prevailing, maybe the samples from number of farmers, and the recommendation came. For instance, in Ghana, they recommended maybe 2 bags of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfite at the beginning, the top dress with solvents. That's the general recommendation. But there are exceptions to the farms, because you need the soil information to be able to know how much nitrogen you have to add. And that is where we are short of. So the mobile lab test that is going on, maybe that would be of help, because it's very expensive to do an analysis If a farmer wants to send a soil sample to the lab,
Oh, yeah,
it's very expensive. So most farmers don't do this analysis. They just depend on the national recommendation, and then they do which differs from one field to another.
Yeah. That's exactly my point. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, that's why these soil tests are helpful. So let me move on in the presentation a little bit now, and I hope to, at the end, definitely have more time for questions. Just want to make sure I get through everything before the end. So I had several different treatment groups and a control group. I'm just going to focus on the first treatment group in this presentation because of time. So those in the first treatment group received the results of their soil tests with the individualized input recommendations that depended on their actual soils. And here's another picture I'll show you. This is another farmer receiving these results. So here's the enumerator giving this farmer, some recommendations about this product, this input. And here she's giving the actual soil test to the farmer and giving him, you probably can't see from where you're sitting, but she's written on that sheet different particular fertilizer recommendations for his soil. But of course, she's giving this all verbally also, because many farmers in this area were not literate. So she's giving a complete recommendation to this farmer. And because we didn't want to have any bias coming from the enumerators knowing the treatment status of the participants prior to the baseline auction, the enumerator's tablet computer randomly assigned the treatment status, treatment or control, after the baseline auction was already completed. So we have some slightly different numbers between the treatment groups, range from 205 in this treatment 3 to 233 individuals in treatment 1. Yeah?
Did the control group also complete 2 auctions?
Yes, the control group also did 2 auctions with no information in between. What they actually did is, for all the groups, just to have something to do in between, they had them play like a memory game on the tablet computer, just to something to put in there, especially for the control group, just so it wasn't just 2 auctions right next to each other. Yeah. So this is the only equation I'm showing, and I'm just going to describe it qualitatively. This is kind of the primary way we analyze these data. And so we have 3 differences here that we're relying on. Difference in willingness to pay for a fertilizer between the 2 auction rounds, difference between the treatment group and the control group, and difference in willingness to pay for a fertilizer between those who are recommended to use that fertilizer and those who didn't receive that recommendation. And so we have these 3 treatment groups, we have these 3 differences, I should say, and we use something called a triple difference estimation technique to try to get out the effect of the recommendations themselves. And these are the results, and I'll explain this. So this is for DAP, or diammonium phosphate. And here in the first column, we have the triple difference estimation results. And what this is telling us, this 60.7, it means that a recommendation to use DAP to an individual increased the average willingness to pay for DAP by 61 Kenyan shillings compared to those in the control group who would not have received that recommendation. And this 60 Kenyan shillings represents 25% of the value of that quantity of fertilizer that we were auctioning. So it's a really significant amount. So this is telling us we gave the recommendations to use DAP to certain individual farmers. This, on average, increased their willingness to pay by a significant amount. In column 2, we add in one more difference, and that's between men and women. So we do something called a quad difference regression. And I'll just point out here, this 20 value, that means that a recommendation to use DAP to women increased their willingness to pay by 20 Kenyan shillings compared to men in the counterfactual group. But it's not statistically significant. That's different from those results for organic inputs. So this is a combination of the organic inputs. This number is telling us that a recommendation to use organic inputs to a farmer increased their willingness to pay by 16 Kenyan shillings compared to those in the counterfactual group. It's not very much. It's only marginally statistically significant. But then we add in that additional difference between men and women. And then we find something interesting. We find that the overall triple difference effect disappears, but we see this really big difference between men and women. So women who are recommended these organic inputs increase their willingness to pay by 34 Kenyan shillings compared to men in the counterfactual group. So women are increasing their bids more than men on receiving this recommendation. And this is controlling for all other factors. And so why is this? Why do we see this gender difference here? We believe it has to do with the differential levels of access between men and women for organic inputs. In our sample, we see that men, on average, use substantially more organic inputs on their soil compared to women on plots that women manage. And I'm talking about here about farmyard manure and compost mostly. And we see in the literature that men, who are usually the household heads, preferentially allocate scarce resources like organic inputs to plots that they manage at the expense of plots that women manage. Also, we see in our sample that male-headed households own more livestock than female-headed households. And of course, livestock is the primary way of obtaining organic inputs. So overall, organic inputs are more scarce for women, at least in our sample. And so what this means is that when we're asking them to bid on these organic inputs, women, when we make a recommendation to them, women who have less access to these organic inputs outside the auction are increasing their willingness to pay more than men. So then we use the results of these triple difference estimations to look at the marginal effects of the recommendations. And all this is saying is we're looking at average effects. So this is for DAP for 1 kilo. At the baseline, the average willingness to pay for DAP for 1 kilo is about 57 Kenyan shillings. After recommendation to not use DAP or to not focus on using DAP, this willingness to pay falls to 7 Kenyan shillings. And after recommendation to use DAP, that their soil would be it'd be really beneficial if they used it, it increases up to 91 Kenyan shillings. And you can see these vertical lines are 95% confidence intervals. None of them are overlapping. Tells us it's a significant effect. And the horizontal red line here, that's the approximate retail price for DAP in these rural areas. So after recommendation to use DAP, the average willingness to pay for 1 kilo is approaching that rural market level. Then we do a cost-benefit analysis using the results of these marginal effects. So the soil test price here is the comprehensive price of a soil dock test plus the cost of, so that includes the test itself, the cost of the technician, and the cost of delivery to the villages if we're doing a large number of samples. These other parameter values are either from our data or from the literature. Then we have two groups here. We have those who increase their DAP use after recommendation to use DAP, and those who decrease their DAP use after recommendation that they should not focus on using DAP. For those who increase their DAP use, this increases the nitrogen in their soil, increases their maize yields, and leads to a net benefit of about 2,500 Kenyan shillings per hectare of maize planted, about $24. For those who decrease their DAP, we're assuming that DAP for these farmers is not having a significant effect on their crop yields because their soils are likely unresponsive. That's why we made this recommendation. And so they're accumulating the money that they otherwise would have spent on this fertilizer, leading to a high net benefit of 13,700 Kenyan shillings per hectare of maize planted. And this is money that they can then use on more profitable fertilizers for their soil. So now just moving on to the discussion of the results and policy implications, we find that overall, these treatments appear to have had a significant effect on increased input optimization by farmers. And what I mean is it's affecting farmer behavior in the way that we would hope it would to encourage them to use better inputs for their soil. We see that the treatment one, the only treatment I talked about today, had a significant effect on farmer behavior, especially overall towards DAP fertilizer, but also there was some interesting results for organic inputs depending on the gender of the participant. We also see through the study that this two-stage experimental auction design can be a good way to measure the effect of information transfers on behavior. And as I mentioned, we found that interesting difference between men and women, especially with respect to organic inputs, and which likely had its cause through this differential levels of access to organic fertilizers, especially livestock ownership in particular. So some policy implications. First, there's some good work being done by some international organizations to try to increase livestock ownership by women in Sub-Saharan Africa. This study shows another reason to increase this livestock ownership, to give more access to organic inputs to women. We also see this from the cost-benefit analysis, that these soil tests can have significant net benefits for farmers through their agricultural profits. And this soil testing can be an effective strategy to better increase input optimization, increase soil fertility, and hopefully increase farmer well-being in this region. So it's something that we would encourage governments, international organizations, NGOs to do more often, especially with the development of this soil doc kit, which makes soil testing much more convenient and easy to do in remote locations. So that's what I have. So I think we have 5 more minutes for quick Q&A. Thanks. Yeah.
So you just said that this could be used to inform governments and NGOs, et cetera. What about the private sector and people who are actually selling the different types of fertilizers? If they're going to make more money, if the farmers understand that it can work better, is there an incentive there for the private sector to move in and do some
Sure, I could see that. So for example, there's that firm that's selling the vermicompost. So this might be a good way for them to, show farmers that they have very low active carbon levels. And so by using vermicompost, that can increase, their active carbon levels, increase organic matter, is complementary with inorganic fertilizers. So yeah, I think it could. It just might be more tricky for private firms because there's that, that large fixed cost. So they would have to do this for a large number of samples for it to be profitable. But if they have that scale, then I think it would be useful. Yeah. Sorry.
Sorry, are there any plans to track these farmers into the future to see if they retest their soil, adopt the behavior, anything like that?
Yeah, so that's something I really want to do. So this is a very short-term study. And the reason we used these experimental auctions was because I'm a graduate student and I didn't have a whole lot of money, so I had to do this in a short amount of time. But what I want to do is go back, to get funding to go back and to go back to these households, do surveys, see if any of their agricultural practices have changed. And then, yeah, hopefully do some more soil tests and see what's happened. So that's in the plans, I hope.
Yeah, the usefulness of the recommendations would depend on having, really good production functions or information on yield response. Do these portable soil test kits give you good information on the full range of factors that will affect response to fertilizer and nutrient?
That's a really good point. As of right now, they don't, but they're hoping to build up enough scale that to get enough samples into the system where they can create that, more detailed recommendation that uses that, yield, the production function, basically. But hopefully in the future, they'll have that. Right now, so we were a little bit limited. Basically, it was kind of a binary recommendation. So for certain fertilizers, for certain nutrients, it was a, yes, you should use more. No, you shouldn't. You should use less or not focus on investing in this. So it was a little bit limited at present, but hopefully we're hoping to expand that in the future.
I was thinking more about the paper you mentioned at the beginning that said how important it is for farmers to trust the information and how the source can really impact this behavior. And so I was wondering about that in your experiment, how you establish trust with these people and whether you think that any of their response might be biased in order to try to please the enumerator and give them the right answer right after they give them a recommendation.
That's a good question, and that gets brought up a lot with this. It's actually an economic concept in behavioral economics called experimenter's bias, where there's that kind of wanting to please the person who's giving you the recommendations. So there's 2 or 3 reasons why we don't think that was a major factor here. The first is they were using their own money. Because we gave them this money, the enumerators made it clear to them is this is money you could use on your school fees or for food. And usually these are pretty poor farmers. And so they have a lot of competing uses for this money. So we believe that it's not something they would just kind of throw away on something that they just wanted to do to please the person who was there. Second is we didn't see overall large effects for all inputs. So we would expect that if this was a problem, we would see, so for example, we didn't see any large overall effects for organic inputs. So if this was a problem, we would expect to see these large effects for all the fertilizers, which we didn't. So that's another reason why we think that this was probably not a big problem. Yeah. But that's a good point. It's always something to have to consider with these types of experiments.
Yes, out of curiosity on the case question, do you have any farmers just say they didn't want to spend any money on that?
Yeah. Interesting. Only a few. There were a few, so there were 0 bids, but not that many. I think there's actually only 3 farmers out of the 884 that bid 0 for everything in both rounds. And then there's a few more that bid 0 in the first round, but then after hearing the recommendations and stuff, they increased to positive amounts. Yeah.
I want to add to the reason why men are using more organic in some areas. If you look at certain rural areas, there's a traditional belief in those areas where the man is to ensure there is food in the house. So, and he owns the cattle. So what they do is they look at, especially cereals, that's what they use in the house. So they have to ensure that the manure goes to the farm that the man is managing because they need food throughout the year. So they need that organic manure in that farm, and the man is in charge of it, so that there will be food available. So that is
true. That's also a good point. Yeah, that the organic. So men are usually managing the main maize plot, and usually they're reserving these organic inputs for that main maize plot. Yeah, I think that's also true.
Thanks again.
Oh yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.